The battle lines are drawn, and once again, somebody's saying, wait, be patient. If they knew how long it would be before all people could truly hear freedom ring, I wonder which end of that moral arc would they choose. I wonder if more would have walked in his shoes. This is what revolution looks like. You gotta get in and then stay in this fight. You've got to find a way to get in the way. Speak out every day. Freedom riders or letter writers, do what you can, just shine your light brighter. Somebody call him a saint among men, a founding father, an icon, a legend. Ordinary people.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our first segment of the Good Trouble Voting Rights Institute. I am attorney Daryl Jones, the board chair of the Transformative Justice Coalition. We're going to be joined very, very shortly with the founder as well as the president of the Transformative Justice Coalition, Barbara Arnwine. We are so excited to have you with us here today with the launching of this Good Trouble Voting Rights Institute. It will be like no other. We guarantee you that. This will be a learning experience. It'll be a fun experience. It'll be current issues, it'll be historical issues, it'll be analytical analysis that's done to put things into perspective for you. I tell you, we're excited to get started. Barbara, please.
Well, first of all, good morning and welcome everyone. And thank you, Daryl Jones, for setting us off, for starting us off, and for all of your great leadership of the Transformative Justice Coalition. I want to thank everybody who has joined to be part of our very first Voting Rights Institute programming. I just want people to know that today is historic because this is the second anniversary of the launching of the 1619 Project. Yes, 2 years ago is when the world was turned upside down, topsy-turvy by the wonderful 1619 Project that had the nerve to talk honestly about how slavery continues to impact every aspect of American society. So today we're going to talk about one of the most important parts of what is called the American institution, the American experiment, the great American trial, and that is the right to vote. So we're going to start with our first slide, which is the narrow path. And we're going to talk about how it was a narrow path. I'm not seeing that slide to this right to vote. There we go. The path to the ballot box, everyone, was a narrow road. It was not an expansive right to vote. We got to remember that the United States of America was created by people who were fleeing Europe because of either religious persecution or because of caste and status reasons. They were unable to acquire wealth, to acquire any property, to be considered high class, whatever. So they were desperate people who came to this country. These were many people, of course, in South Carolina and in Georgia. Those original colonies were composed of felons, ex-felons who were desperate to escape imprisonment. And their option to not being imprisoned was to go to the colonies and work. And so when you look at who came here, these were not the top hierarchy, the top royalty, the top, quote, divinity of ancient Europe. In fact, in they were considered the outcasts. And that had a lot to do with the hardening of the way in which they constructed American society. Next slide. And before I leave that, Daryl, did you want to say anything about that narrow path?
Yeah, thank you, Barbara. And it's really interesting when we talk about the narrow path, because what you will see as you go through this course today, and as you go through the course overall throughout the entire series, is that it's almost a cyclical type of experience, because you start with a very narrow path, and many would argue that today we're returning to what appears to be a narrow path of trying to narrow the way for people to have access to voting. So it's really an interesting concept as it comes along. When we start, and as Barbara, as you were talking about the felons that were originally sent here as part of the people to establish, and at that point would be able, if they were landed aristocracy, be able to have voting rights. It's interesting to watch as we develop this, that we'll eventually get to a point of talking about what? Felony disenfranchisement.
Right.
And those very people not having that right to vote. So it's going to be an interesting experience, and I just can't wait as we move along with that type of analysis.
Yes, and we got to remember, everybody, that America was founded on several principles. One is that the United States is what's called a settler colony, a settler colonist society. That means that people settled in this country and were originally colonists of their European nation. So that's how you end up with a nation of colonies. And remember, the oldest colony in the United States was not British, it was not German, it was not Spanish, it was in fact Spanish. And that was in Florida. Florida had the first original colony that was here in the United States. And so we get this backwards all the time about our history, because we talk about Plymouth Rock, but Florida was already colonized very early. So 1619, of course, is such an important date, because that's the date when the first Africans were brought here as enslaved to work in the United States land. So what determined your right to vote? Your right to vote was based on some of those principles of religion, and basically race, and property rights. And because remember, these are people smarting, they're hurting, because in Europe they were considered the worst class, the outcasts. So they built a huge caste system to build themselves up as the new royalty. And that's kind of missed a lot when we talk about what drove people to be so hard that they would engage in the kind of property land theft that was done to make this country happen, the kind of racism, the kind of justifications that were created. You have to remember who these people were. Daryl, before we get into the next slide.
And you left off one important piece of that, I think, Barbara. We talked about racism, but I don't think we talked about the sexism.
Yes, please, patriarchal. Thank you, Daryl. Absolutely. Come on, my brother, because patriarchy was a huge basis of the new, quote, American colonies. So we're going to talk about that because that affected who could vote. So let's go to the next slide. Colonies, property and religion. We would also add their race and gender, right, Daryl? Because those were the basis. What was property? Remember, in Europe, they had what was called primogeniture, which meant that only the first son could inherit the land. Only because of primogeniture, there was the inability the second, the third, the fourth, the fifth sons, and don't even talk about the poor daughters. Their value was in who you could marry them off to and acquire more land, more property, etc. So people, get this really confused about what we were doing because Daryl and I are lawyers, so is Lynn and some others, but we're taught about primogeniture when we teach, when we learn about property. And so primogeniture meant that only the firstborn, and the only way a second or third could get any rights was if the firstborn was dead or somehow was deceased. But usually the firstborn had children, and then that firstborn's children were the next in succession, not the second son. So these second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth sons, those are the people who came to the United States and were so desperately, but they engaged in slavery. And remember, the first slaves that they tried to enslave were Native Americans. Don't get this twisted. We get all these pictures about, all these compacts and accords and treaties. They tried to enslave Native Americans, but because of the isolation of Europeans from Native Americans were very susceptible to European diseases. And so a lot of Native Americans died because of diseases that were brought over by Europeans. Well, they decided that slavery was the answer because remember, if you look at your maps of Europe and Africa, you'll see they almost touch each other at the most western northern tips, but also because of the landmass that went from the Middle East into Europe. So there was a lot of African interaction with Europeans, not to mention the entire period of the occupation of Spain by the Moors. And most of Spain, most of Portugal by the Moors, who were in fact Africans. So we forget about all that history, but because of that interchange, because of that great commerce and so much interaction originally, Africans had a greater immunity to European diseases. And so that was one reason why Africans were, quote, successfully enslaved, because they could outlive these European diseases. So property, we created in the United States a new concept of property, and that property is called chattel property. And Africans, enslaved Africans, were considered chattel property, not people, chattel property. And then on the religion side, I just want to point out really quickly that people don't know that our nation is also founded on what's called the doctrine of discovery. If you never heard that, look it up, write it down. Doctrine of discovery, which was a papal decree out of the late 1500s that basically said, please go forth, Europeans, into the new colonies and basically conquer and conquest those heathens. Go into Africa, grab those folks, because they're all heathens if they are not Christians. And by the nature of your Christianity, you have domination over them. And you have the right to enslave, the right to take their land, the right to dominate them. So be sure to read the doctrine of discovery, because guess what? As we talk today, that papal decree is still in effect. It has never been rescinded, even though there's been repeated requests of indigenous people for its rescission. Daryl.
Barbara, when you lay all of that out, one of the things that becomes really interesting is to see the interrelationship between the firstborn concept, meaning the firstborn male really is what we're talking about,
Yes.
inheriting the right to vote, inheriting the property, etc. But one of the things that that sometimes people miss, and I think that you brilliantly brought it up, is that it's also intertwined within biblical teaching with regard to that firstborn, that first birthright. And I think that's when we begin to see the intertwining of the American Constitution and religion, and begins to explain why the founders in doing the Constitution wanted this division, so that we could have that division that then comes into place. So I think that as we're going through, we'll see a lot of this intertwining and understanding, and able to break things apart that will evolve with what we're going through here today.
So thank you, Daryl. So the first people were able to vote in the United States were people who were white, who were male, and who had property, who were property owners. That's very important to remember that in that first construct of who could vote, they were white, male, property owners, and they also, in some colonies, had to be of certain religions. So we move on to the next slide. And this is just a reminder that the expansion of the right to vote was slow. It was hard to get away from those concepts. This nation still suffers from having a settler colonial mentality. It still suffers from the patriarchy that it brought over from Europe. It still suffers from the elitism and the over-respect, the over-empowerment of the rich in our society. It still suffers from the exclusion of people of color. I always, when I teach, I talk about how people see people of color and Native Americans as interlopers in the US democracy, not as essential, involved, people, and essential to a multiracial democracy, because some people in their head still believes we are a white nation. And that's the settler mentality really continuing to dominate. But the fight was slow, but it was effective. The first big fight was over property rights. Other white males saying to white males, especially after the independence, after, the War of Independence, that we all have to have the right to vote, regardless of our property rights. So property rights was the first to fall as the basis. But let me be very clear. If you're reading the writings of Fadum and some others right now, what are they saying? They're saying that we need to reconstruct American society to only give the right to vote to people with property. So we're going full circle, full circle. Daryl, any other comments before we get to this, out of this slide? Because we know there was a huge battle for years over who could vote and the right to vote.
Yeah, Barbara, I think that, you just underscored and highlighted what I said in the very beginning, that, it seems as though the more things change, the more they stay the same. And it's almost cyclical in nature. And here we are back trying to be certain that people are not excluded from that right to vote. And we tend to continue to go over that same track and the needed protections for those individuals that are not landowners, that are not the wealthy, that are not the aristocratic of our nation, and being certain that their rights are protected. So as we move to the next slide, I think that we'll continue to see that type of issue coming up.
So as everybody remembers, the nation grew from the eastern part of the US, because that was the part closest to Europe where the ships could land, all the way through, then there was the expansion, around the nation, around what is now the geographical North America. But you got to remember that during this time, Spain's not quiet, Portugal's not quiet. They are moving to California. They are taking over the West Coast. They are, settling there. Above us to the north is the Canadian colonies. They are French and they are British. And below us are the Spanish colonies in Mexico and South America and Central America. So as the expansion starts happening is after the War of Independence, after the Constitution of 1887, after all of this is done and you got a new nation, then we start having expansion. And of course, one of the things that the US celebrates is the purchase, the Louisiana Purchase. The Louisiana Purchase was largely from the French, and that brought huge land. But people don't talk about the Treaty of Hidalgo. The Treaty of Hidalgo was after the Spanish-American War and the Mexican-American War, I should put it more correctly. In the Mexican-American War, we signed a treaty that basically allowed us to, the US, to gain all the land that went to the coast, to the West Coast, to the Pacific Coast. And that's how New Mexico, California, and all of those lands came to be. But what people don't know, and I'm just going to say this real quick, Daryl, is that California, that name is something from somebody called Queen Khalifa. Queen Khalifa was a fictional queen, African queen. When Spaniards went to colonize California, the only way they could convince the people, their shipmen to go there was by telling them this mythology that California was run by Black women, that there were all these beautiful African queens and princesses who dominated California, and that Queen Khalifa was their head. And there was, if you think I'm crazy, look it up. Once again, there's the Queen Khalifa novel. There's a whole novel, and that was part of that narrative. So that when they went to California, they found, of course, there were, very, remember Africa. You got to look at Van Serma's book. They came before Columbus to understand that Africans were already in New Mexico, Arizona, California, when they came. So there was a basis for believing all this crazy stuff, that there was this Black Amazon nation. So California, everybody, is named for a Black African queen, fictional. So that is something that we also miss. But if you look at the original seal for California, they have a Black woman as the seal. Khalifa. But moving on, Daryl, my internet is saying it's unstable, so I'm just warning you. So you're next.
All right. And Barbara, was really interesting with regards to the pre-Civil War and the freed slaves' right to vote is that we know that as the nation developed, particularly in the African-American community, the Black community, that there's a division that sort of occurs. And you begin to go into the philosophical piece of understanding the freed slaves' right to vote, and them believing that they had greater rights than those that were enslaved and didn't have the right to vote, and all the areas that you then go into with regards to the aristocracy and the landowning and everything else that then kicks in. But it's important to understand that, prior to the Civil War, that free slaves did have that right to vote.
That's right.
And there were a lot of pressures that were still applied to them, but they still retained that right. And as we go to our next slide, Lynn.
And before we leave that, can everybody still hear me? Just wave at me. Okay. We want to be very clear that not only were free slaves allowed to vote in many of the colonies, but beginning in the 1830s, as slavery was really being challenged by the abolitionist movement, that states like Pennsylvania, Virginia, many other states start taking away that right to vote because they started feeling that free slaves were a threat to the institution of slavery. And in Massachusetts, you will see, so many stories about Cato and so many stories about so many Africans who fought to regain the right to vote. But I won't go into all those stories today. but there's a major part of history, especially from the 1800s until the Civil War, where Blacks are fighting, petitioning, really trying to regain their right to vote that was stripped of them during that period.
So Barbara, tell us about the abolition movement and its impact on voting.
Well, you know, people talk about Frederick Douglass. People talk about Stevens. People talk about, you know, some of the, I mean, you can't talk about, there is, without the abolitionist movement, there is no Civil War. Without the abolitionist movement, there is no women's movement. Let's be clear. Never would be a 19th Amendment. Most of the women advocates who will become the fighters for the history from Seneca Falls all the way into the 19th Amendment came out of the abolitionist movement training. The abolitionist movement was a movement of people, and they were diverse. Some were abolitionists who said slavery should never exist. It should be gone. It's immoral, it's wrong. Every human is the same and is equal, equally endowed, and it's the same as each other. There were abolitionists, however, who believed that, listen, we got to get rid of these Black folks, that they're a contamination on our society, that we need to get them away and out of the United States borders. There were people who said, well, you know, I'm kind of in between. I'm not sure if the Blacks are, you know, fully as human as whites, but we think they belong in their own country. So there was the, return to Africa, you know, groups that were very strong, and that's how you get Liberia, right? There is no Liberia in Africa, which was the return colonization of Africans to Africa, which caused its own problems, because how do you just send people to take over somebody else's nation? So anyway, wow, you know, you can.
And what's the capital of Liberia, Barbara?
Oh, Freetown. That's right. So thank you, Daryl. So that's the other story. So when you talk about abolitionists, they're not all the same people. There are many different, different movements. And remember that President Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln, was a member of almost all three camps at some point in his life, where he once, was all about returning folks to Africa, and was not clear that not of the same belief that Africans had the same endowments of humanity as whites. Then you have the Lincoln of the 13th Amendment. There's that famous meeting that you should look up that Lincoln has when he first becomes president with the African American male leaders, because patriarchy is still dominant, and he has the nerve to talk about these his belief in colonization, of returning Africans to Africa. And you will read about how he was chastised and booed and treated very unpresidential, as the reports say, by the African men. Had a few of our sisters sneaked into that meeting because they weren't going to have it. Monrovia, thank you. Monrovia, thank you. And the capital of Sierra Leone, which is another one of the countries for which we had that recolonization, it's Freetown. Thank you for that correction. So in any event, moving on to the next slide. Okay, Daryl, this is one of my favorite slides, because there's a lot of misteaching of history. And anybody, I do welcome any corrections, to anything we say, or any additions as people, because we got teachers in our midst who are listening. Black soldiers, people don't understand that when Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, it was to infuse the Union Army with Black troops. The Black troops become literally the backbone of the Union Army, not the dominant number, but over a third of all people who will die in the Civil War will be African Americans. men who went to fight for their freedom. That resulted in a whole lot of things. I don't have time to talk about it today, about what it did to the Black family, how it affected African-American women and children, all kinds of issues that we still deal with to this day. But in any event, the men went to fight. And when the Civil War ended, let me be clear, it wasn't because the, quote, radical Republicans wanted Blacks to have the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments that it happened because of these Black soldiers. They threatened to march on Washington, D.C. if they didn't get the 13th Amendment, if they didn't get the 14th Amendment, if they didn't get the 15th Amendment. The most interesting period of history to study is the period of 1865 through 1870, because that's where, remember, basically the Constitution is asunder, because you got all of these states that were in rebellion. They got to get readmitted to the Union. They're just not automatically back in the Union. They got to get readmitted. And during that readmission period, that's where you get imposed the first requirements for African Americans to have the right to vote, even before the 15th Amendment. And be very clear about the 15th Amendment. It's the last amendment because even the radical Reconstructionists among themselves, they had disputes about whether or not Black men, because it was all about the Black male vote, should be allowed the right to vote. And those Black troops were saying, we ain't having it. You better give us our right to vote, or you're gonna see us in our armed glory on the streets of Washington. That's an untold story. It's a vital story to know and to understand. Daryl.
Our next slide.
Next slide.
And so, yeah, Barbara, so we have this grouping of amendments that came out that really dealt with the abolition of slavery, that dealt with the right to vote, as well as, the 15th Amendment. That's really some interesting issues that developed. We all know that the 13th Amendment obviously was the amendment that abolished slavery and involuntary servitude. What I think becomes really interesting, though, Barbara, is when we start talking about the 14th and 15th Amendment and that right to vote. Generally the 14th Amendment we recognize as it bestowing upon men the right to vote, Black men, all men, the right to vote. But the question then becomes this, Barbara, and this is the one that stymies a lot of people. Why was the 15th Amendment needed if we have the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment talks about the very same thing, that right to vote? Why did they need to use the 15th Amendment to affirm the 14th Amendment?
Because, as I said, a lot of the radical Republicans, a lot of, quote, the abolitionists were opposed to the right to vote. Some of them were okay with social, equality, but that right to vote was considered the last step, and that it made Black men equal to white men. And that also it meant that Black men, if you're really going to honor that right to vote, that means Black men would have the right to govern white men. That concept was unacceptable. How can Black men govern white men? That would put the Black men in charge. And they hated that concept. In fact, some of them went back and argued about property. All these Black men don't even have property. All these kinds of arguments. Oh, you should see it. I mean, the record of that period is one of the records that's so untaught. And also, you got to understand, folks, when slavery ended, it didn't, quote, end. Blacks were being massacred, brutalized, maimed, re-enslaved. We know that it took 2 years for people to hear about the Emancipation Proclamation in Texas. Well, heck, it took longer in Oklahoma. as we found out when we were there, for the freed men of the 5 civilized tribes to even find out that there was an Emancipation Proclamation. But in any event, that period, you should read those congressional hearings about what Blacks were going through. And remember, there's nothing that was more threatening to the white conscience at that time for many people was than Black domination, Black control, Black governance. It was driving them nuts. So even in the North, people found that concept hard to swallow. So it's no accident that there was the right to vote, the 15th Amendment was actually simultaneously suggested, in fact, even before the 13th Amendment. People were trying to get what would eventually become the 15th Amendment passed. It took 5 years for the radical Republicans to get there.
And you know, Barbara, one thing that's really interesting, and you would know this as one of the scholars in dealing with these issues, is that there's an argument that exists, a statement actually that exists that says that really with the 15th Amendment, it really took 95 years for it to be enforced. And it wasn't enforced until when? 1965.
That's why we love the Voting Rights Act of 1965, because people get it twisted. They say, oh, well, Blacks have the right to vote. That's not true. And in our next class, we're going to talk about what happened with the 15th Amendment and the African-American right to vote, because between that period, there's something called the Hayes-Tilden Compromise. We're going to talk about the 19th Amendment. You know, you don't even want to hear me talk when people are saying women should put on their white and celebrate the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment. I'm like, really? What women? Because not all women got the right to vote, even though technically they should have. But we know that our sisters were denied that right. So there's a lot that we'll talk about as we move through this class. But I do want people to know that when you see the First Amendment, of course, that's the freedom of speech and so many other clauses that are included in the First Amendment. 13th Amendment is that very tricky amendment, because it says that, you know, everybody's free to except who? Those who have been convicted of a felony. The 14th Amendment establishes citizenship for Africans. And that's even a long story about what does the 14th Amendments, because that's where it not only talks about that it's establishing freedom for Africans, it also talks about African descendants. That concept comes out of the 14th Amendment, and it gives, you know, people the right of citizenship. And one of the things that it did, however, in its first, in the first provisions of the Constitution, under the 14th Amendment, in its first provisions, it also had a clause that said you could deny the rights of citizenship to someone who was convicted of a crime. And you got to be very clear about this, that this concept of social death comes into play. That's a European concept, that once you are convicted of a crime, that you are socially dead. Remember all those people I told you who fled here from because they were prisoners and were given that right to come to the U.S. That was because they could they could accept social death. They could escape social death. So we got to understand, you know, how that all plays into the whole fight, as Daryl said earlier, around felony disenfranchisement. 19th Amendment was technically the right for women to vote. The 24th Amendment, got rid of the poll tax, and the 26th Amendment gave youth the right to vote, those 18 years and older, the right to vote. But let's go back to let's go to our next slide, because we are coming to the end of our class today. Wow, I can't believe it, Daryl. Post-Civil War and Reconstruction era, look at that. That picture below is the picture of some of the Black Congress people who served during the Reconstruction era. People need to know that we didn't have our first Black Congress people during, post the 65 Civil Rights Act. We actually had not only congressmen, we had senators. And there's a vicious story. If you've seen the Black massacre map, which we will show for the next teaching, you will realize that that this fight, once the 15th Amendment was passed, it's not like everybody just said, okay, that's wonderful, let's let Blacks vote. No, 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 no. There was a vicious fight. And this post-Civil War era, the Reconstruction era, was beautiful because literally thousands of Blacks took and became elected officials, and thousands of Black men, I should say, became elected officials. Let's be very clear, Black women were never quiet about this. Black women were always saying, Daryl, we want our right to vote too, but we are going to make sure that our brothers get elected. And so there's all kinds of beautiful stories out of this era of sacrifice, of working together to get people elected, to build Black male voting strength. There's so much to be said, but we're gonna stop. And I'm gonna turn it back to you, Daryl, for your concluding comments, because because this was such an incredible era. And one thing, I wanna say, everybody, there's before we end, is that there's something that irritates me always on this discussion of the early part of the fight for the right to vote, because I want to make it clear, from the minute Blacks stepped on this colony and this colonial land of the United States in 1619, they started demanding the right to vote. They started demanding their freedom. So there was never an era in which Blacks were not fighting for their right to vote. The other thing is, I get really upset when people say, well, it wasn't a crime against humanity because that's what Europe was doing and everybody was just doing the same thing. That's not correct. Europe did not have that concept of chattel slavery. We got to be very clear also that, that remember, America was called the experiment. It was to have been an experiment in creating greater equality, and the entirety of our police system was new. It was not a European concept. This patrolling, all of that was because of slavery. So we created, in order to have the US during this entire period of our early history, we created new institutions that were unheard of in Europe. So don't be talking about this was just the mores of the times. No, new things were done so that people could, get their wealth, get their political domination, try to rule and dominate in a new society and land. So I want to give that to you, Daryl.
Thank you, Barbara. Thank you so much. And there's so much information that we are hoping that our listeners were able to pick up and learn and just absorb. And one of the things that we laid out that we want to be certain that you get an opportunity to go through and truly understand, and that is that when we were speaking of the 24th Amendment and the poll taxes, there were 5 states that were the primary focus of that 24th Amendment. You had Virginia and Alabama, you had Mississippi, Arkansas, and Texas. Many of the very true offenders of what's going on in our country in dealing with voting rights today. And those poll taxes were imposed to discourage particularly African Americans and Black voters from being able to exercise their franchise. That poll tax, many argue, still exists in the state of Florida, where they require people to in order to regain their franchise after felon disenfranchisement, to pay whatever it is that their fine was, even if they can't tell you the amount of that fine. That's a poll tax, folks. That's still what's going on here today. A lot of what you've heard today from this discussion, you're not going to be, in many states, Texas, for instance, you won't be able to get in the classroom. Why? Because they're trying to stop critical race theory. They're trying to stop the very nature of the substance you've been learning today. That's what they're trying to stop in the classrooms. That's important for everyone to be able to learn. You've got to know the history in order to be able to project the future. That's what we're pushing forward here today. As we move on to our next Good Trouble Voting Rights Institute, we hope that you hang in there with us because there's so much more learning to go on. There's so much more information to present. We want you to be part of this TJC family. We want you to be learned up on your voting rights and know what to do, when to do it, where it came from, why it's here, and why you're fighting right now for voting rights in this country. I turn it back over to Barbara.
Yes, and we want to remind everybody that this coming weekend, not this weekend, but next weekend, on the anniversary of the 58th anniversary of the March on Washington, that Transformative Justice Coalition will be in Washington, D.C. with 900 people. And Daryl Jones has been our big visionary of helping to put together this schedule, but we are offering to people, and it's still open, folks, the opportunity to get on COVID vaccinated safe buses and travel to Washington, D.C. Yes, let's show the slide. And we are going to be hosting everybody. The buses are free, and we're putting people up for 2 nights of free hotel stay at the Marriott Marquis in Washington, D.C. Yolanda, we can't see the flyer. All right, it didn't work. I am so sorry. But we want people to go to our Eventbrite and to to join and to follow that Eventbrite instructions and to become part of here. There it is. There it is. There's our flyer. You can see there. We're inviting people. Those are the cities where we have buses coming from. And when you go to that Eventbrite link, you can find out so much more about how all this has been organized. Again, not a dime for people to ride the bus, not a dime for people to stay. And we got educational programs. Hey, if you thought we were bringing it in these 45 minutes, wait until you get to Washington, D.C. Right, Daryl?
Absolutely. Folks, be certain to go to that Eventbrite site and sign up, get on the bus, and there will be all types of COVID protocol that are in place because we want to ensure your safety. But in addition to ensuring your safety, we want to ensure that you learn, that you have the opportunity to learn from those that came to the March in Washington, had experiences with the March in Washington. Reverend Jesse Jackson is going to be with us in Washington, D.C. We have a whole slate of folks that are going to be joining us to talk about where we are with regards to where we are now with the March in Washington and the voting rights. We have students that are coming from HBCUs. We have Howard University is going to be in the house and certainly on the panels. Folks, you do not want to miss it. Don't miss it. And if you can't make it, you can watch us on Facebook Live because it's all going to be streamed on our Facebook Live channel at the Transformative Justice Coalition.
And again, thank you so much. We look forward to next week. Next week, we'll be coming to you from the Lincoln Memorial, because that's the event that we're supporting, is the one at the Lincoln Memorial. And we look forward to seeing you. And I want to thank everybody on our great committee who's put together this institute. Please spread the word. Please invite other people to join in the coming weeks. We are so grateful to you, Lynn, to Ashley Lee, to Jennifer Lohman, to, oh my goodness, I will be here, Katrina and Kiana and Denise Lieberman and Jessica Barker and so many other people, and Yolanda Coley, and so many who have worked so hard to make this institute a reality. We are grateful to you. God bless all of you. We will see you in Washington as we get it on next week. Thank you so much, Cynthia Robbins and Karen McCrae and all the others who have helped us. I turn it back over to Lynn.
Thank you so much, Barbara and Daryl. That was so informative. I can't tell you how much I learned just in those 45 minutes of presentation that you did. And for everyone else, I know Barbara has to leave. We did put in the chat the bit.ly link for the Washington rally next week. So you can grab that from the chat too. It's just bit.ly Good Trouble DC and register to get on one of those buses. Before Barbara leaves, if there are any questions of Daryl and Barbara, please let us know. But while we're doing that, Jennifer, who's working the back end for us, would you look at our participants? We actually had quite a few participants, 19 participants on today. And we would like for 3 of you to just tell us the value that you get from today's lesson. So if Jennifer, if you could see and select 3 of those participants, and we can elevate them, see if we can elevate them to a panelist shortly, quickly, just so we can hear from them what they thought the value was.
And I'm gonna have to leave, but I want to thank everybody. And Betty Magnus, I see you're here. Thank you, my dear. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for everyone. Hope to see you very soon. Take care. I got another presentation to do for the Women for the International League for Freedom and Justice. So I have to go to that presentation. They moved it up an hour. So that's why I'm encroached upon. This was never my intention. Take care, be blessed. Thank you so much, Daryl, for your leadership. Thank you, Lynn. Take care.
Thank you, Barbara. And so we may not be able to.
No, so Lynn, anybody who would like to speak, rather than just like, calling people out at random,
Right.
If people would like to raise their hand or note in the chat that they can, that they would like to speak, I will enable them to unmute themselves and say something about today's presentation. So please raise your hand if you would like to speak, and I will be happy to put you on now. Betty, you are already ready. I will ask you to unmute. You may certainly speak. And Ayana, I see that your hand is up too. So you will go after Betty. You may unmute when she is done. And let's see, I think those are the only 2. Come on, don't be shy, people. Raise your hands.
Well, that's okay. If we only have 2 right now, that's fine, because we do have a couple of more things we need to complete before the hour is up. So
right.
Let's go ahead with those 2.
Super. And then we do have a 3rd person who has raised their hand. So Betty, please proceed.
Okay, my question was regarding the right for youth to vote. And I thought Barbara said the 26th Amendment, but I wasn't sure. But I did want to know how that came about, that they added the youth to the vote.
Betty, that's something that will be covered at a later lesson.
Okay, no problem. Thank you.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, all right. I just wanted to say how valuable I believe that this class is. A lot of these things were taught in short lengths. Like when I was in school, I've been out of high school for a really long time. And even when I was in college, these sort of classes aren't offered. So it's very valuable, because if we don't continue to teach these things, and see, I'm 40 years old. I just turned 40 years old. And a lot of these things that were spoken about, I had no idea about. So it's important for our griots and our teachers and you all. Thank you for this, because we can't continue the fight without continuing these stories and these lessons. So I just want to say thank you.
Well, thank you very much for attending. We really do appreciate that. We do have something else. If you just give me a second, I will be getting it up for you.
So Lynn, we do have a few other people who have raised their hands. One is identified on screen as Queen Karen. She's the next. And then we have Cynthia and Denise who would like to say something.
Okay, we can go ahead and let them say something.
Good morning. I'm Queen Karen Garrison. And the question I think was, what did we get out of it? And what I got out of it is I can't even say how big and how much information I got. You know, I do a radio show and I'm always boasting about being news, information, resources and updates and things like this. And I come in contact with a lot of, you know, highly educated people and youth. Yeah, when I say youth, I'm saying from 15 up that think they're educated in our history, but I bet you they don't know these things. And I'm able to take a plethora of notes here to be able to, on my show, when I give a history part or tell them what I've done for the week, and this would be it. So what I get out of this is information to share, to update and give real information to people when they're talking about our history, because we don't want it to be repeated. We want them to know it. So that's what I got out of it. A lot of information to share. And I thank you so much. And Cynthia, I thank you so much for putting me in this space. And I thank everyone for allowing me in this space.
Well, let me just say, one of the reasons we're doing this too is so that it could be shared with others. So there will be recordings available later that civic organizations, churches, and organizations can use. So thank you for attending. I know you said we had a couple of more. We do have a few things that we need to do before the close of the hour. We are being respectful of everyone's time. And I believe you said it was Denise and Cynthia. And I'm going to ask if you two can hold your comments since you are on our committee. And you can share them with us on our next committee meeting. But I would like to go to our next slide if y'all have no problem with that. We do want to do a little recap before we get out of here. So if you don't mind, I'm going to go ahead and share. So this is a quick recap. I want everyone to think about this based on everything that you learned about who could vote. Would the founding fathers have allowed you to vote? And just think about that. And so this tells you a little bit. It's a kind of just a little recap. Remember, it was property, white males, it was some religious, it was own property, you know, there was a lot of things. And this is just kind of recaps what Daryl and Barbara have shared with us. And based on that, I don't know how many of the people on here would have been allowed to vote. But guess what? We're going to find out, because one of the things that you're going to have to do, and you're going to excuse me for just a second while I put up my next thing, because this is a school, this is class. So we don't want you to think that because you're in class that you get to get away without doing work. So if you would just bear with me, we do have things that you do have to do. We are requiring homework, and I'm going to get up that. And share that with you, because I want everybody, if you are on here because you want to get a certificate, we are asking that you do some basic homework with us. So this is your call to action. So your call to action is list all the reasons you would not have been allowed to vote by the country's founding fathers. And then list when is the next local election in your city, county, and or state. And so you might say, well, Lynn, how do I list that? Where would I list that? Well, we have created the Good Trouble Voting Rights Institute Facebook group page. So when you go to that page, you will join that page. And if you were on this broadcast, and we do have a record of who was on it, you will be able to join. It will be a private group just for those who registered for a certificate to be get a certificate from the Institute. And there you would post your responses to these two calls to actions. All the reasons, not just one. You just can't say because I'm a woman, or you just can't say because I'm Black. All the reasons you would not be allowed to vote by the founding fathers, and then list. And so find out when is your next local election, your city, your county, and or your state, and post it. Now, before we leave, I have one other for you, and it's a closing word from the youth.
Hi, I'm Jonice and I'm 8. And even though I'm not old enough to vote yet, I think voting is important for citizens. It helps us get good people that can make good choices about my future. Go vote!
I just love it. She is so cute. Thank you so much. And I know it is 12:01. So I want to thank everyone for joining us today, coming out, and our inaugural session of the Good Trouble Voting Rights. I'm sorry, y'all. Good Trouble Voting Rights Institute. And thank you so much. And we will see you next week live from DC.